I'm going to be very frank. There's no politician in this country who's going to disagree with their chief medical officer. They just aren't going to do it. They might as well throw a rope around their neck and jump off a bridge. They're done. I'm telling you the facts. It's very simple.
All businesses of any type are allowed to open 100%. That includes any type of entity in Texas. Also, I am ending the statewide mask mandate.
As many jurisdictions in the United States and elsewhere are bringing their lockdowns and restrictions to a halt, Ontario is buckling down.
I'm extremely concerned on the situation that we're seeing and the numbers right now. So folks, be prepared. I'm asking you, don't make plans for Easter. That's what I can tell you. I won't hesitate to lock things down if we have to.
Impervious to the real-world data demonstrating the immense death and destruction caused by lockdowns, and the uselessness of mask mandates, PCR testing, and social distancing, the largest Canadian province continues to oppress its citizens with its catastrophically harmful, unscientific edicts. A 3-week lockdown in some parts of Ontario was recommended by the government's COVID-19 Science Advisory Table this week, which warned of exponential growth, notwithstanding the copious amounts of evidence that lockdowns do not control the spread of the virus, and despite the fact that this province's numbers have never been out of control, the ICUs have similar burdens as recent years, that the vast majority of infected people requiring hospitalization are elderly, and nearly half with comorbidities, Ontario's Science Table and other COVID-interested organizations such as Global Canada continue to propagate fear-mongering, doomsday predictions, and advocate for heavy and hard lockdowns. The Ontario Science Table was created as a COVID response team to inform and advise the government. Ontario Premier Doug Ford religiously bends to their warnings, and his policy decisions, to lock down or to open, are heavily influenced by their forecasting models and pseudoscience. Peter Juni, the Ontario Science Table scientific director, recently stated to the CBC, "Right now in Ontario, the pandemic is completely out of control." He further went on to warn that winning this race with vaccinations alone wouldn't be enough. This is very concerning, considering Peter Juni's most recent fear-mongering warning to the government to impose a complete lockdown of all indoor spaces, which includes shutting down travel between regions.
It's probably inevitable. I hate to be the bearer of bad news there, but what we're seeing is if we just are smart now and just change attitude and go back to the way we locked down a year ago, one more time, and just focus on the areas that actually are in trouble right now, and that's really predominantly the Golden Horseshoe, then we probably get the things under control again. And we're just talking about a few weeks. This is not again months and months and months, and it's not again that we don't know where we're going. We know exactly where we're going. The problem is that we now are just in the middle of this minefield, and we just need to tread very carefully, and we can't get out of it just with vaccination. That's impossible.
Meanwhile, in Texas, where all restrictions have been lifted, including mask mandates and social distancing, cases and deaths are on a steady decline, as one would expect from a respiratory virus this time of the year, in line with the well-known Hope-Simpson curve. The Ontario COVID-19 Science Advisory Table is comprised of over 30 academics from various disciplines, most of which, like Juni, are members of the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School. Their mysterious methodologies have a notoriously terrible track record, with their estimations of sickness and death consistently multiple times higher than reality. For example, David Fisman, epidemiologist and professor at Dalla Lana, and one of their highest profile and most vocal members on social media, tweeted on January 12, 2021, that there was a tsunami of death coming, which of course turned out to be false. In a paper Fisman co-authored with Juni in May 2020, they drew the astonishing conclusion that seasonality is likely to play only a minor role in the epidemiology of COVID-19, while public health interventions, school closures, restricting mass gatherings, social distancing, appear to have a major impact. This directly contradicts decades-long, strongly supported science on seasonality for respiratory infections. Admittedly, the authors state that the study has a number of important limitations, in total 7, of which the first is, because of considerable differences in testing practices between different geopolitical areas, actual rates of COVID-19 could not be reliably estimated. The paper also states that China was excluded as its epidemic growth had decelerated and the outbreak appeared to be contained, mirroring the official narrative told by the CCP that non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as lockdowns, could contain the virus. It therefore appears that the study is extremely flawed and is merely a piece of propaganda to support the justification for the imitation of China's lockdown experiment and other extreme, never-before-heard-of social mitigation measures, rather than sound science. Fissman is also an extremely loud advocate for restrictions that are seriously detrimental to children, despite all evidence of their unnecessary nature and immense harms, such as school closures, mask mandates, and social isolation. In May 2020, he lamented how he had not hugged his own children since the beginning of the COVID debacle.
Thank you for the privilege of appearing before you. The last several months have offered us as a country extraordinary challenges. As an epidemiologist, internist, and parent, these challenges have subsumed every part of my work life and my personal life. I haven't hugged my kids since mid-March.
As if that wasn't enough, Fissman has a multitude of conflicts of interest listed in his resume, which include big pharma brands Pfizer and AstraZeneca, JP Morgan and Chase, the WE Foundation, the Ontario Nurses Association, and the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Anthony Furey reported for the Toronto Sun that Fissman was retained by the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario to offer an argument against the Ontario government's school reopening plans at an Ontario Labour Relations Board hearing. This work was taken on at the same time Fissman was serving on the Science Table, which advises the government on matters including school reopenings. He was accused of hiding this significant conflict of interest and became extremely defensive and denigrating to his critics. When this was brought to light, Chrystia Freeland, federal deputy prime minister, publicly rushed to his defense. What reasons would the right hand of the prime minister have to get intermingled in petty social media disputes and slight press criticism regarding provincial-level politics? Then we have Global Canada, a previously dormant organization founded in 2014 by Robert Greenhill that suddenly became very active in October 2020 following a mega financial contribution of over $500,000 by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They funded a task force called the COVID Strategic Choices Group, meant to inform the government pandemic response with a goal of zero COVID, citing Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan as examples to follow. They call this strategy the Canadian Shield, and its methodologies include test and trace, isolation, and heavy, hard, ongoing national lockdowns with closed borders.
The race on to contain the spread, the busiest place to be in lockdown, testing queues. Brisbane CBD noticeably quiet as more than 2 million people in 5 local government areas face tough restrictions and the cases keep coming.
All of which it advocated for in a policy paper published on December 30th, 2020 called Building the Canadian Shield. Ontario Science Table members, including David Fissman, promoted the paper upon its publication. Although they are separate entities, the COVID Strategic Choices Group created by Global Canada has members on the Ontario Science Table, such as Andrew Morris, and who contribute to the Ontario Science Table, such as Ashley Tuitt. Interestingly, shortly after the time that Global Canada was revived after receiving Gates money, Tuitt, who regularly publishes papers with Fissman, attended a virtual conference in Beijing on COVID response, featuring keynote speakers from the WHO and the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Another example of the enmeshment is the social media bromance between Ontario Science Table's David Fisman and zero COVID hysterics such as Ryan Imgrund and Irfan Dalla. This trio is notorious for sharing doomsday scenarios and grossly exaggerated predictions. If we consider the notion that Global Canada is a globalist organization founded on the apocalypse is nigh principles of global impact and social justice, it makes sense that members of its COVID council are Malthusians, cult-like ideologues who believe humans are a cancer to the planet. Robert Greenhill founded Global Canada in 2014, after returning to Canada following his significant, over half a decade-long role as managing director at the World Economic Forum.
We actually essentially achieved close to COVID zero this summer. But because the expert opinion at that time was it wasn't sustainable, we kind of let it go. We threw away our shot. I think our report suggests that we shouldn't throw away our shot this time, that as we go through the tough measures over the next weeks and couple of months, the determination should be to actually drive the community cases down to zero this time.
Greenhill began his career working for McKinsey, a controversial consulting firm with deep ties to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the WHO, and the opioid crisis. McKinsey offered COVID pandemic guidance and recovery support to the US and other governments around the world, including an unsolicited offer to Ontario for $1.6 million. McKinsey's former global managing director, Dominic Barton, offered a big helping hand to Ottawa's Economic Advisory Council for free in 2016 while active at McKinsey. He has very close ties with the Liberal Party and has now moved on to his role as Canadian ambassador to China. McKinsey's Ontario headquarters are conveniently located at the University of Toronto campus, the same U of T that boasts the majority of the Ontario Science Table's members. If this web of characters and organizations seems overwhelmingly obscure and confusing, it's because it is. There are many more alliances to investigate in the Ontario COVID zero swamp, but let's end with Eileen Davila, Toronto's top doctor, and yet another University of Toronto faculty member at the Dalla Lana School.
The province took action to implement a number of new requirements aimed at limiting the spread of COVID-19. Many of the actions announced by the province are the result of its willingness to listen.
Aside from the obvious conflict of interest resulting from her husband's ties to Big Pharma, she has been an unrelenting public health tyrant throughout this last year, exercising her unelected powers to switch off the lights on thousands of businesses and households in Toronto, including the permanent closures of an incommensurable number of restaurants in the GTA. The Adam Skelly fiasco, when his barbecue restaurant had the locks changed overnight and over 250 police officers showed up the next day in a breathtakingly unprecedented abuse of force, were all the direct result of Davila's orders. Davila is a fear-mongering lockdown lord with a stone-cold disposition.
I recognize that these recommendations will result in significant adjustments.
But there are cracks in her armor. She recently posted on social media, "Data show a worsening COVID-19 resurgence in Toronto, including hospital and ICU admissions among younger people." After a humiliating confrontation by COVID-19 data analyst Kelly Brown, where he stated, "Dr. Davila, I do not see in the data the rises in hospital and ICU admissions among younger people that you are referring to. What am I missing? There appear to be no material changes in the age makeup, including stable average age among Toronto ICU patients." Davila quietly changed her post from "data show" to "we're hearing." These are the types of blatant lies, omissions, and misinformation that the COVID zero cult are guilty of. Their sticky spiderweb is infested with conflicts of interest that include Big Pharma, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the WHO, the World Economic Forum, and possibly links to the Communist Party of China, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. They produce questionable scientific papers in what appears to be an attempt to provide the conclusions they seek in order to justify their harmful recommendations. How can these conflicts and the perverse incentives they create possibly lend themselves to good, sound, and holistic public health policy helpful to the constituents and society they serve? They have been consistently and dramatically wrong about their predictions, yet aggressively continue to push for hard restrictions, indefinite lockdowns, and abusive policies that disproportionately affect small businesses and children. The Ontario Science Table's David Fissman even went so far as to endorse intentional mass unemployment. Even if their terribly inaccurate modeling projections turned out to be correct, or their apocalyptic prophecies came true even once, lockdowns were never a part of the repertoire for dealing with a pathogen or any other government-declared emergency. They violently oppose every pre-existing public health guideline in the Western world for how to deal with a pandemic. The amount of destruction, suffering, and death resulting from the brutal lockdowns has been cataclysmic and will ripple into the future of all its victims. They are the true tsunamis of death. To quote Peter Juni's latest statement of moral panic, "It's important now that everybody just wakes up and comes out of denial."
I practiced medicine for 40 years in two specialties, public health and internal medicine. I worked in local public health for 15 years. I was Ontario's Chief Medical Officer of Health for 10 years, and I was directly involved in the 2003 SARS outbreak as Chief of Staff of York Central Hospital. I published academic and popular articles on relevant subjects like SARS, quarantine, and bird flu. Canadians on the whole enjoy a wonderful standard of health, resting on the foundation of the social determinants of health: education, employment, and our social fabric. Anything that threatens these foundations threatens our public health. Canada is now faced with both a tragedy and a crisis. The tragedy is caused by COVID, a respiratory virus. Its potential to cause deaths of tens of thousands of Canadians has the potential to cause the death of tens of thousands of Canadians, overwhelmingly old and infirm. The crisis is caused by our attempts to control that virus. The crisis has the potential to cause severe and lasting damage to the fabric of our country's economy, education, social and cultural institutions, and mental health that will have repercussions on our public health for decades. The tragedy is a natural disaster that saddens me and saddens us all. The crisis is a self-inflicted wound that frankly terrifies me.
Thank you for the opportunity to answer your questions today.